Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, José Luis Granados Ceja, Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer at Venezuela Analysis, as well as host of the podcast. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the program. It's good to have you. How you doing?
Great to be here. My name is Kurt Hackbarth. I write for Jacobin Magazine in the United States and Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for another episode of Soberanía.
Excellent. This week we're going to start with something special because why not? Let's have a conversation about sovereignty. I mean, that's the title of this podcast, right?
That's what we're about.
That's
right?
what this is.
Yeah.
That's what we're about. That's what the pillar of the fourth transformation of Mexico. But as everybody knows, we're in the middle of an election, and oddly enough, Xochitl Gálvez, would you believe it, talked about sovereignty. I was blown away. But maybe we won't like what she has to say.
I think
so I have this video queued up here.
Different take on it than we do, José Luis.
I'm
suspecting.
All right, maybe. I think you're onto something here. So let's play this video, and for our listeners who don't speak or understand Spanish, we'll translate it real quick. It's just only about 20 seconds long.
Entonces, esta agencia binacional de aduanas tendría agentes certificados de los dos países y de esa manera nos cuidaríamos unos a otros. Ni nos meten armas, ni entra fentanilo. Es el momento de dejar de hablar de esa idea de que la soberanía, que no haya cooperación. La agencia binacional.
There you have it. So to give you a little bit of context, this is actually the bankers meeting, if I'm not mistaken,
right.
That was held very recently here in Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum also attended. But here is opposition presidential candidate Xochitl Gálvez talking about creating a binational customs agency, that is to say, cooperating directly and integration, more like it, by the way that she's selling it, of the customs organizations or agencies in Mexico and the United States, with the argument that, well, in this case, they will help us keep the guns from coming into Mexico and will help them keep the fentanyl from flowing out of Mexico into the United States. But the curious thing that she says there, as at the end, which is that enough with this idea of sovereignty, just so flippantly casting away something that is very important to the Mexican population. Now, this idea of sovereignty, it came as a result of the Pact of Westphalia. It's very much a kind of a European liberal institution. But, when we're talking about countries on the global periphery, like Mexico, it's a very different idea when we talk about sovereignty. We talk about, as we had said many, many times on this program, about defending the ability to decide your own course, essentially, to say that we have our own priorities, we have our own interests, we want to tend to the needs of the population, we want to use our natural resources to pay for that. That's sovereignty for me, anyway. But for her, it's almost like she talks about it like it's an impediment, like it's something standing in the way. And it's not too surprising if we actually look at our politics, which I think it's quite funny when people talk about this election as not really being about a left candidate versus a right candidate, when you have one of them so flippantly disregarding sovereignty, which again, I want to emphasize this. In the case of Mexico, a semi-peripheral country, sovereignty is valuable. I've mentioned this in other programs. There's an actual museum here in Mexico City dedicated to all of the foreign interventions so that we don't forget what it meant to lose that sovereignty, and to have one of the leading presidential candidates to so easily say, hey, we need to stop talking about this because that's not important. What I want to do is cozy up to the gringos.
Yeah, and add to that, right, what you just mentioned about the idea of sovereignty for a country like Mexico. Just a year or so ago, Ann Milgram of the scandal-ridden Ann Milgram, the head of the DEA, came out and basically admitted that despite Mexico's more rigorous national security law, the DEA carried out an operation for over a year in Mexican territory against the Chapitos without ever informing the Mexican government whatsoever. Right? This is how the U.S. rolls with sovereignty. They don't give a crap. They don't give a crap, even with that stronger law. So in that light, giving the United States control of your customs, what could possibly go wrong? Right? I mean, seriously, what could possibly go wrong? Right? Besides the fact that, of course, the United States would never go along with a binational customs agency and having, Mexican agents involved in their part of customs, right? And this
It's
is
true. In fact, I was just going to mention in Canada, you can actually clear customs if you're flying into the US while you're still in Canada. But there's been a lot of controversy precisely because the US will not just hand over its sovereignty. In fact, if you enter the screening area in Canada on Canadian soil, you are subject to US law and US jurisdiction. And you can actually get in really big trouble if you decide to withdraw. You can actually be detained by US authorities. It's extraordinary. The US wouldn't go for it. Sovereignty for me, not for thee. We have the case just very recently. Again, I always like to link it to the region, right? US just finished imposing sanctions, illegal sanctions on Venezuela, once again on its oil industry, right? We had a webinar last month with Max Isle, and he made a great point. He's like, when it comes to imperialism, they don't care about sovereignty, right? So in fact, to have somebody willing to hand it over, to not defend it, is really quite worrisome.
And the point to round this out is exactly what you mentioned at the outset. For the Mexican right, this idea of Mexican nationalism, the fact that there's a museum dedicated to this in Mexico City, are antiquated, outdated ideas related to this old Mexican nationalist idea. Hence all this rhetoric over the last 5.5 years that AMLO is trying to bring the country back to the 70s, right? Or, whenever they say, right? Sovereignty for them is an outdated concept, and it doesn't belong in this globalistic world, right? That they think, with very willful naivete, that Mexico can simply plug into globalism and get all the benefits without any of the predatory imperialist, baggage that comes along with that. It's absurd. But as we've talked about in this program, Xochitl Gálvez runs off to New York to the Council of Americas, runs off to the Wilson Center. The PAN throughout these 5 years, every time something happens that they don't like, they run to the Organization of American States and cry to Luis Almagro. They run to Spain, right? Members of the right have even complained to the Spanish king, right? Gustavo de Hoyos complained to the Spanish king. They didn't like things that AMLO was doing. This is the mentality, right? And so when you see Xochitl Gálvez poo-pooing the idea of sovereignty, and in the same breath saying we're going to hand our customs over to the United States, the same country that rides roughshod over Mexican sovereignty, with all of its intelligence agencies, and think that that's going to fly, good luck with that one.
Also, come on, how do you people think drugs are getting into the United States? Do they think that Border Patrol has its hands perfectly clean? I always use the analogy of a prison. How do you think all of the contraband gets into prison? It's not the prisoners, it's the guards. It's the same thing when we're talking about borders. This idea that somehow the gringos are beyond reproach and they would more successfully handle this. It's an absurd notion, right? But it really makes a very clear message. And then before we move on from Xochitl Gálvez, I figured we'd also take a look at this, something you shared with me earlier, which is just a little bit more of just who is the caliber of candidate that the opposition has. And this is from an event talking about children's rights, El Pacto por la Primera Infancia, basically trying to get all of the candidates to commit to a certain bare minimum when it comes to the interests of children and youth in Mexico. But oddly enough, we have this scene here, and I'll let it play.
El Pacto por la Primera Infancia. Muchas gracias.
To sign as well.
This should be a pretty easy thing to do.
Quite clear. The easiest thing in the world. That was already signed. Whoops. What's the sound on The Price is Right?
Ahora sí le pedimos a nuestros amigos de la prensa que por favor.
So, I mean, come on, right? Like, I get it. We all make mistakes, but it's mistake after mistake. We talked a lot about that in last week's episode. It's just, and it's obviously showing in the race now. I think, the polls are not moving whatsoever. Claudia maintains her very strong lead. I saw they're bringing out all of these old candidates. Anaya released a video talking about how we were right 6 years ago, even though
he was wrong in every single point that he mentioned. Yeah.
I know. But I guess this is the desperation. I wonder when reality is going to dawn upon them. Oddly enough, the only one who seems to be doing moderately better is Jorge Mañez. Jorge Alvarez Mañez, the candidate for the third political force here in the country, which, again, is likely to just take votes away from Xochitl and not really touch Claudia Sheinbaum. So that's the state of the race.
Yeah. There was also the video where, Xochitl's got this gum thing, right? The idea of taking the gum out at inopportune moments. She took her gum out at an event and put it in the hand of an assistant, which is pretty degrading for the assistant, right? Take my used gum.
Yeah, that's pretty gross.
Yeah. Again, these are little things that add up, but you would think that the campaign, after a series of gaffes, would have found a way to take care of these things. But they don't, and they continue. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, I saw even an interview. There was one where she's like, "Oh my, all the advisors tell you something different. I'm going to be more authentically me." I guess authentically, Xochitl is somebody who doesn't bother to read where her name is on the board and signs in the wrong space. I think the authentic Xochitl is the one who's willing to so flippantly hand over Mexican sovereignty, or one that doesn't even have basic respect for the dignity of her own aides. Right? In Japan, they sell gum in little cups, and those cups have little pieces of paper so that you can take a piece of paper and spit out your gum when you're done with it. Right? It's as easy as carrying around a sheet of paper, some Post-its, whatever it is. But anyway, it's it's not a strictly political topic, but I think it speaks a lot to the caliber of the candidate.
Yeah.
So moving on, we're going to talk about something that I think you've been following very closely. So I'm going to let you take the lead here in terms of introducing the topic while I put it up here on the screen. But I wanted to talk about the pension reform this week, which has been the major topic of conversation here in Mexico. But let's begin. Set the scene for us. Why are pensions such a hot topic in Mexico, more generally and specifically now in the campaign?
Sure. So we've talked about in this program how Mexico went through a massive series of privatizations in the 80s and 90s under Carlos Salinas de Gortari and Ernesto Zedillo. And the pension system was not exempt from that. The previous pension system was based on a law of 1973 which set up for, again, salaried workers, who had deductions from their checks, a pension system which was paid out through the IMSS, the Seguro Social, right? Seguro Social system. So that pension was calculated based on your last 5 years of earnings to try to get up close to 100% of earnings, right? So Cedillo in 1997, right, just a couple of years after the tequila crisis and the massive devaluation, right, the country in ruins financially, says, we can't afford these pensions anymore. We can't afford this pension system from the law of 1973. So what did they do? They imported kind of a hybrid Frankenstein of the U.S. Kind of 401k model and the Chilean private pension model, and privatized the pension systems, and created in 1997 a system called the Afores, which are individual pension plans, which I know very well because I got here in 1999, just 2 years after that. So, I didn't get grandfathered into the old system, right? I, like most, young people up in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, were on the privatized system. So it's really a generational thing. So the Afores were supposed to create, use the benefits of the markets and use the benefits of the stock markets and get great results and great yields for your individual pension system. So there was going to be, pay-ins from your employer, pay-ins from you, from your deductions, right? And it was supposed to be a great magical solution and at the same time save the government money. What happened? Well, as you can imagine, these didn't do very well because what the government did was handed over 6 billion pesos, I think that's the current amount, in funds to a cartel of private banks, which we talked about on the last episode, right? Just the few banks, an oligarchy of banks that control the system. And well, they had a great time with that because they charged all kinds of commissions on those individual pension accounts, invested the money how they wanted, made very juicy yields for themselves, and paid out very small yields on the individual pension plans themselves. So the pension plans weren't growing, right? You get ridiculously low yields on those pension plans. And they're trying to say, and you too can add more into individual contributions to these pension plans. It's like, no, thank you. Actually, no, right? So all of that by way of saying that, as the Labor Secretary, Luis Alcalde, pointed out in a video that we're going to show, if you were to get your salary of 10,000 pesos a month, before, in the old system, you'd get something close to that when you retired. But with the new system, you worked at 10,000 pesos a month, and you would retire at 2,700 pesos a month. That's it. You'd be retiring at 30% of your earnings, or less, 25 to 30% of your final earnings from work. So it's throwing a whole generation, right, back into old age poverty. And let's not forget that old age, the old age was traditionally the highest poverty rate, simply because you can't work like you used to when you were younger, right? People forget what it was like before Social Security. People forget what it was like before pension systems. Old age was the highest poverty rate. And of course, you have more health problems. You have costs and such. So in 2020, AMLO passed AMLO and Morena passed an initial reform to this system, which, as we see on the screen there, reformed the abusive commissions and required employers to pay more in. So that was an initial reform. More employer contribution, more employer pay-in, and less commissions on the part of the banks. So that helped somewhat, but it didn't correct the problem. So when AMLO came out a few months ago with his 20-point constitutional reform plan, one of them in there was this pension top-up plan, right? To create a fund, a governmental fund, to top up the pensions using earnings from some of the infrastructure projects, airports, the Maya train and such, and also reclaiming a small percentage, but reclaiming a number of pensions that have been idle and unclaimed that the banks were required by law already to hand back to the government, but never did. They just didn't. They just pocketed the money and started, earning interest and such on it. And so the right wing over the last, few weeks has gotten into a tizzy that, they want to steal your pension. They want to steal your pension because they want to force the administrators of these afores to do what they were supposed to do already, which was hand back the money in unclaimed pensions. Now, if you claim your pension later, you can always do that. You can always do that, even if you do it years later. But the banks and administrators can't just pocket it, right? And one of the persons who's been leading this charge is our friend, Ricardo Salinas Pliego, right, of TV Azteca, who we've talked amply about, who has his own afore and hates the fact that he can't just, put this money in his pocket. Now, just to, again, round this out, this is a kind of a center-left proposal. A left proposal would be to bring the pensions back into public hands, completely. Go back to the 1973 law, or something similar, updated. What AMLO is saying is we're not going to eliminate the 97 reform, but we're going to top it up, right? So that you can retire, again, with your pension from your last, 5 years, up to the average salary in the Seguro Social, which is 16,700 pesos a month. So up to that, up to the earnings of the average salary in the IMSS, you'll be able to retire with your final salary. So it's a good proposal. It's one that should be passed, right? The right-wing critiques are ridiculous and have no theoretical merit whatsoever, or factual merit whatsoever. I think a fair left critique of this proposal is it could widen the gap between salaried workers who get their money deducted out of their checks, who are going to now have better pensions, and people in the informal economy, which is a large number of people, up to half the country, who won't benefit from this reform, because this is for salaried workers who are in the formal employment system. Now, there is the separate pension, the universal pension of 3,000 pesos a month, and that, of course, applies to everybody. But this is going to be a large, a large fund, which is going to go to salaried workers. So people in the informal economy, there has to be a way that they are not left out of pension benefits.
The part that really jumps out at me has been the right-wing manipulation of the topic. Because you're right, it's not a radical reform. In fact, if you were to ask me, I think we do need to go further. I always say, I should have an Afore. I don't have an Afore. I'm not putting away money for retirement. And when people ask me, well, what's your plan? What are you going to do when you retire? And I was like, I'm betting on social transformation. I'm hoping that we'll be able to once again conquer these gains that were won in the previous century once more, so that I can count on a social system. I mean, it's in the name of the institute, Instituto Mexicano de Seguridad Social, social security. The idea is that we should have a socialized system that is there for everybody, formal and informal workers, so that when you retire, when you've done your 40, 50 years of work or whatever is the expectation these days, because we're living longer and longer, that you should be able to retire with dignity, that you shouldn't have to scrape your coins together to be able to pay for medicine or for the bus and things like that. And obviously the universal pension has gone a long way. We've talked about that a lot previously as well, about how important that is for people who never had a pension. But I do think that, it's been extraordinary to see the reaction from the right wing. I froze it on this frame here where the image says, don't be fooled. Because they're really going on an all-out campaign to try to tell you that they're going to seize your private pension. Oh, it's the specter of the communists coming and taking away your hard-earned money that you put away, which isn't even true. Because even if they did seize unclaimed money, you can always go back as long as you can prove that that's your money, that you can actually claim it back. The idea is to socialize that money that should have been socialized in the first place. And I love that you brought in Salinas Pliego. It was a point that I was going to make, which is that, he sends his attack dog, Javier Alatorre, to, go on air and put out these kind of doom and gloom scenarios about the authoritarian nightmare in National Palace, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, and I opened with this image here from your tweet, which is where you just said, the opposition just voted against raising your pension, because there was a vote yesterday around whether or not to create this special fund from the unclaimed in order to top up pension funds.
That's right.
But, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the fact that they're on the record, the PAN, for voting against making a constitutional right social programs. And it's coming to bite them in the butt in this election. Because now people are like, well, if you're telling us that you're going to save these programs, why didn't you vote for them? I think in the future, likewise, people will be like, hey, when we were debating whether or not you should earn 100% of your salary in retirement, you voted against it. I mean, this is going to have consequences for them down the road.
And right in the middle of an election campaign, right? They're betting that their campaign of saying, pensions, don't touch the pensions, just like you don't touch the Electoral Institute. Nothing can be touched, right, by these people, is going to fool people into not seeing that, 2 months before a presidential election, they voted against raising people's pensions. Right out there. And all of them, the PRI, the PAN, Movimiento Ciudadano, which is supposed to be the different party, the third option, they all went along with it. Right? Last night's vote was not the constitutional reform vote. That will probably come after the elections, seeing how the new Congress shapes up. This was a regular law vote to set up that pension fund, to get it going. To be honest, Moreno was a little slow out of the starting gate defending this. They've defended it well over the last few days, but they were a little slow responding to these absurd charges with, the same people that basically stole the pensions are now trying to frame themselves as the guardians of the pensions. And that should have been pointed out immediately in 30 seconds. They were a little slow on that. That's coming out now.
Yeah. I think also, one of the things that jumps out at me here is that if you look at how the vote broke down, right? The tweet from Revista Polemon says the lower house of Congress approved with 252 votes in favor and 212 against and 4 abstentions. So what does that tell us? The Congress very much is polarized. That it seems that, especially now, given the election context, that the votes are kind of breaking down along party lines. And why it's so important that Morena is pushing for a strong majority, if not a supermajority, in this upcoming election, because they understand that when the opposition is able to accumulate more strength in the different branches of government, then they're able to more impede their agenda, right? And so I think that's one of the key things as the election is also shaping out in terms of what is the voter turnout going to be. Things are not looking good in terms of the opposition's possibilities, as we just spoke about, and so that might lead to a low voter turnout, right? And so now Morena has the task of actually mobilizing their base to ensure that they're able to win as many seats as possible to advance their agenda. And here in Mexico City, where the race is a little bit competitive, I think they exaggerate a bit. I think the narrative that they're trying to put out there is that Santiago Taboada, the opposition candidate for governor of Mexico City, has a stronger possibility of winning than he actually does. But nonetheless, it is a more competitive race than the presidential race, making sure that your voters actually come out. I was discussing this with my partner the other night. I wonder what the party is going to do here in the capital, right? Because Clara Brugada is a very interesting candidate. She comes from social movement. She's been a part of the sort of the left flank of the party for a long time. She represents that, more utopian horizon in terms of her political vision and things like that. I think she's a very interesting candidate, something that, I wish more people were paying attention to in terms of her trajectory and just how significant that someone with her profile is at the place that she is. But, there is a danger, right? There is a possibility of the opposition winning in the capital. So it's important for them to figure out how they're going to do it. And I think my expectation would be that they actually turn to that base, turn to the working class in this city and say, have we earned your vote? These are our proposals. Do you think that, they're worthy of supporting? And if so, make sure you actually come out and vote on June 2nd.
Yeah, absolutely. And just very quickly to end on this point, in a very typically fiery speech last night on the pension reform debate, Gerardo Fernandez Noroña said, the real conservative party isn't you guys. Basically, you guys are ineffectual. It's the Supreme Court. And of course, you're banking the Supreme Court will, will reject this law. We'll, veto it. We'll call it unconstitutional. And we'll pass it again and again and again, as many times as is necessary. And that may very well be likely. Be necessary, sorry.
And returning to the issue of the campaign trail, I thought we'd move on and talk about some of the images that we saw very recently over this weekend of Claudia Sheinbaum in Chiapas. Now, actually, you did a fantastic interview for Jacobin magazine. We'll put that link in the description of the video. Around the issue, Chiapas, most of people will know Chiapas because of the 1994 Zapatista uprising, the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, a kind of, they call it the first postmodernist guerrilla, but inspired by indigenous intellectuals, but also combined with Maoist organizing that historically it was happening in Chiapas. Chiapas has been in the news a lot because we've seen an uptick of violence. And we've also seen in the campaign the way that they've tried to kind of exploit the unresolved social issues in Mexico's poorest state,
right?
In order to try to say, well, see, you voted for Morena, López Obrador, after 3 tries finally wins, and he hasn't been able to solve anything. But where are the masses at? Which is always my question. How are the people responding? There's also been a lot of criticism of Morena in Guerrero. And likewise, there's still very strong, solid base of Morenistas in Guerrero, in Oaxaca, and Chiapas. And so we have this image here from Epigmenio Ibarra. I'll just translate it quite quickly here. So what happened with Claudia Sheinbaum in Chiapas was very moving and extraordinary. Dozens of thousands of people filled the plazas of Tila, Bachajon, my apologies, Las Margaritas, Comitán, Motocintla, y Tapachula. Many thousand more filled the highways to show their support. This rice has already been cooked, which is a way of saying that this election is done. And it is quite extraordinary. I think what we're seeing is a very strong consolidation of the political project known as Morena, right? Like to get these kinds of the turnout, to see this kind of enthusiasm and support. I mean, look at this image here. It literally goes beyond where the eye can see in terms of the turnout, at more than capacity for these events here. And so we can see the enthusiasm, and particularly in these states, the states that have been historically marginalized, historically oppressed, that are continue to embrace Morena. So I think there's it reminds me a bit of Bolivia in the middle of the last decade, where you really saw a very strong consolidation, almost approaching hegemonic status in terms of their strength in certainly some parts of the country, like the South that we're talking about here in the state of Chiapas.
Yeah, a few points on that. And I do recommend that everyone, if you have a chance, read my interview with the anthropologist Leonardo Toledo in Jacobin. It's called Violence in Chiapas. And it really lays out the difficult situation that Chiapas is in, right? Not only as Mexico's poorest state, but also a border state. Okay? As Toledo points out in that interview, Chiapas had the bad fortune of having to deal with these massive immigration flows coming up from the south, in large part propitiated by U.S. policies and sanctions and embargoes, as we've pointed out, and also due to a very corrupt government in Guatemala previous to this one. Right? Arevalo just won in Guatemala, and they tried to stop him from taking office. But what was an area that was once, seen as kind of a space controlled by, in certain areas, Sinaloa cartel, which had a very juicy border business, they're now disputing it with Jalisco New Generation. And this has created a situation where even the Zapatistas have had to pull back, right, from their caracoles in councils of good governments. And, there's also a discussion in that article about, how feasible over the long term was the Zapatista policy of not having anything to do with governments, not receiving government benefits of any kind, expelling anyone that got government benefits of any kind, a very, extreme line on that, in the midst of, a situation as extreme as Chiapas, with the weapons coming in, with the pandemic and whatever else. So it is a difficult situation, right? And I think it was very brave of Claudia Sheinbaum to go right in there, right? Because anything could have happened, right? And got these.
Well, something did happen.
I was just leading right up to that, and got this incredible reception. Right? Because there's also the problem in Chiapas too that before Zapatismo, Chiapas was in practically a feudal economic system. Controlled by wealthy ranchers that had their own goon squads, and that was how things ran in Chiapas, right? The goon squads were the law, not the law itself. They were all in cahoots.
Yeah.
And so the problem historically in Chiapas, and as in some other states as well, is at one point all of the wealthy people were in the PRI, right? Then they jumped, right? All the people, these old families jumped to the Green Party. Right? Now a lot of them have jumped to Morena at the local level. Right? So there's been a lot of critiques that it's basically replicating the old system of the old Chapan families. Right? But all of that said, the old Chapan families couldn't turn out numbers like this. This really shows a real groundswell from the bottom, from people who've really suffered a great deal in Chiapas, right? With immigration flows, with the arms trade, with cartels in certain areas. This is clearly a very organic swell of people, and you can see in also the videos the people following along Claudia Sheinbaum's motorcade and such, her car. With all the stuff I just laid out, Morena is building something there, and it's good to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, like we've talked about it previously, right? There is a historical debt to these regions of the country that were so marginalized, that were treated as sources of cheap resources, essentially, and cheap labor, even in that case, not quite, because they would have preferred to keep that more semi-feudal kind of arrangement in place. But you mentioned that, she dove in, given the circumstances, given the security challenges in that part of the country, and something very curious happened, and I wanted us to talk about this. And in fact, this is a tweet from the person you interviewed, Leonardo Toledo, and he says something very funny, that so what ends up happening is that somewhere along her journey on the highways of Chiapas, she is surrounded by masked individuals. And these masked individuals, they say, don't forget about us, we're still here, we need supports and things like that. So not necessarily kind of an aggressive posture,
Not aggressive rhetorically, but they were clearly stopping the car, right?
But physically, yes, exactly. Yeah. In terms of, if I was Claudia's security detail, I'm not sure if I would have made the same decision to stop and roll the window down. But we have this screen capture here, and there's a very curious thing that happened during this so-called ambush by masked men, which is, what's that in the corner there that we can see in this image right here?
It's the microphone. A microphone from Latinos. The Latinos.
And what's Latinos?
Yeah. What were they doing there?
Exactly. How did they happen to know that this was going to happen, right? It's very, very suspicious. Now, nothing has been determined conclusively. Who were these individuals? Why were they there? Did Latinos have the tip and that's why they were there? Or was this a show? Or was this a montaje, as we say here? And the president this morning, in his morning press conference, said he's of the belief that this was all a setup, that this was all just a staged scene to try to make it look as a dangerous part of the country, and that Claudia Sheinbaum, is exposing herself to risk, and that she is not actually receiving such a warm reception from everybody in the state. But I think it speaks to what we've talked about a lot on this program as well, which is the dirty campaign, right? Latinos is effectively controlled and owned by the Madrazo family. Roberto Madrazo being of the PRI. He admits it himself. He's like, my children are the owners of this, right? And then they funnel money through the opposition governments at the state level to keep the operation going, which we should note is actually based out of the US, not based out of Mexico. But it's very curious that they were there, right? So the attack dog of the media, of the right wing, happens to be there and intercept. And I think it's quite suspicious. And, like I said, so this is the individual that you interviewed in that article. And he says that, oh, they're so kind, those masked men. They even brought the little cube of Latinas. It looks like they're not missing any little detail. Right. And the truth is that, right? This is the opposition campaign. So they will stop at nothing, including presenting these scenes of danger. And I think if they had even more nefarious intentions, thankfully they didn't, they could have actually brought harm upon the candidate in this instance. It was a very, very worrisome scene to see actually take place.
Yeah, and one of the Latinos correspondents, I put that in quotes because it's not our genuine news organization, right? It's just a hit machine. Puts on his Twitter, she got a real shake-up down in Chiapas, Claudia did. And actually she didn't, because if the idea was to put her to the test, she showed remarkable sang-froid. As she has in her campaign stops, as she has in her press conferences. She's been criticized for not being, charismatic in the AMLO sense, right? And she isn't. But she's got something else, which is this no-nonsense poker face, right? Mm-hmm. Which shuts down aggressive and adversarial questioning in situations sometimes. And that's what happens here. So it worked very well to her advantage that they stopped. She rolled down the window. She listened. She said, fine. And then they asked her about it afterwards. Totally. Yeah, the poker face. Right?
Yeah.
It's always going to be a challenge to be a woman president. Obviously, we've talked about Mexico's, heritage of machismo, right? And the evolving way that Claudia is creating her presidential image is this image of just kind of take no shit, not get angry, not get, not whatever else. Because the double discourse is if women get angry, then they're accused of being hysterical, they're accused of being emotional, all of the stuff they throw at women. So she's got this kind of, roll with it, poker face, not take any shit, on to the next.
Yeah, I think she handled it well. She de-escalated what could have been a very tense situation, and I think if the aim was to make her look bad, she ended up looking better as a result. So perhaps they need to rethink their strategy. Now we're going to talk about the situation in Ecuador and the diplomatic dispute between Mexico and Ecuador in the moment. We figured we'd go back and review this really quickly. So Noboa, the son of the banana oligarch who became president in an interim election, actually had a really important test this past weekend in terms of where's his popularity at. And they had a popular consultation, which is a very common instrument that is being utilized in Ecuador as part of their constitution. And a lot of it, the questions were largely dealing with their security issues. So we know Ecuador went from being one of the safest countries. When I lived there, it was very comfortable, safe to go out at night, to now quite possibly the most dangerous country in all of South America. And this has been a result of corruption, of a lack of investment in social services, a defunding of the prison system, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of reasons why this has been happening, and there's been a lot of popular pressure to do something about it. And it's interesting because basically the vote was, do you agree with the militarization of the country? Do you agree with using the army to engage in security tasks? And a whole number of other questions and things like that. Which I find it funny that this criticism of militarization is one that's often leveled at López Obrador because of, his preference for handing over certain aspects of, the ports and the airports and things like that to the military. When we have an actual case of militarization, right? The actual use of the armed forces for security tasks being done, and the same criticism isn't made. Why? Because, Noboa is a friend of the international capitalist class. But one important thing I wanted to add before I hand it over to you is that there were actually two sneaky questions as part of the popular consultation. One was around, shall we switch to a system where you can pay workers by the hour instead of the day? So for those of you who don't know, even though hourly wages are very common in North America and Western Europe, in Latin America, the wages are by the day. So an 8-hour workday is meant to pay this amount of money. And this was a basically neoliberal measure to promote part-time contracts, 0-hour contracts, this idea of making labor more precarious, more flexible, to use the language of the neoliberal ideologues. And that proposal was rejected, as well as his proposal to actually submit Ecuador to international tribunals, which obviously favor transnational corporations that were set up essentially to take away the sovereign power of states to decide over these disputes. And so the two key social questions, he lost. And I think that's really important because what does that tell us? Noboa had a certain strategy, it seems, by attacking the Mexican embassy to try to see himself as the strong man. And so while his reforms for the militarization of society did pass, I think in a lot of ways, it may not have worked out the way he wanted to. And now he's increasingly isolated in the region.
Yeah, and that's important what you mentioned about the referendum, the fact that voters rejected per hours contracts. And what's called in Spanish arbitraje internacional, we know it in English as the investor-state mechanism. Americans will remember this very well with the debate over the Trans-Pacific Partnership back at the end of the Obama years. And that's why, that contested Democratic convention of 2016, the huge chant, which I can still remember, is no TPP, no TPP. And one of the big sticking points for the American left, very rightly, was not handing over, judicial sovereignty, again, to investor-state mechanisms, international investor-state mechanisms and arbitration mechanisms that favor international corporations and dilute and weaken national ability to regulate their own laws and regulate those corporations. And Ecuador's got a history of opposing that, and they showed out, they came out again for that. So that's very important. So what I have in the tweet, as I said here, this one's, I'll read it though for people who are listening to us on audio. Latin America begins to close ranks with Mexico over the Quito embassy invasion. And there was a series of, moves to show how that's happening. First, Colombia canceled its bilateral cabinet with Ecuador. That's, of course, the Petro government. They had a bilateral cabinet set up from before to handle border issues, bilateral issues of that kind. Petro pulls out of that. Venezuela closes its embassy and withdraws its personnel. Honduras, the day of the CELAC meeting, Honduras hosted the virtual CELAC meeting dealing with this, recalled its ambassador, and there was widespread condemnation this was last week at the CELAC meeting. Why is this important? Well, we talked about in the previous episode, I'm certainly not going to go through the whole series of steps again, how the United States and Canada were very tepid in responding to Ecuador's invasion of the Mexican embassy and kidnapping of Jorge Glass. Then AMLO came out and released the footage of what Ecuador had actually done inside, and that led the United States to at least make a somewhat stronger statement and said the OAS should get involved because the OAS is imperialism's baby, right? And so
I love what you had to say, where AMLO successfully managed to kind of highlight the difference between the White House and the State Department, right? We have to think, sometimes we think it's like the U.S. government, this monolith, it's all the same. No, there are certain fissures between these different groups. The State Department had a terrible line, and the White House, I think for diplomatic reasons, was forced to come out with a better position. And that was thanks to AMLO. You're right.
Yeah. And so a few days after that, AMLO gives a virtual talk to the CELAC conference, not to the OAS, to CELAC, which is the grouping of Latin American and Caribbean countries, and laid out the steps that Mexico is suing Ecuador in the International Criminal Court, and is attempting to get Ecuador banned from the United Nations until they repair the situation, right? And asked for help from CELAC member countries to sign on to that initiative. And a number of them did, right? In addition to what I mentioned in the 4 points over there. So this is the danger, right? Because the United States, Laura Richardson, Southcom, they want Noboa to create discord, right? Like Milei. They want Latin America to be disunited. What they don't want is the boomerang effect of the invasion of an embassy uniting Latin America, at least to an extent, around a very basic principle of international law, the sanctity of embassies. Because that would just la tira por la culata, as they say in Spanish, right? Kind of a rebound effect of a gun, where something that's supposed to be promoting disunion winds up promoting union. So that's why the White House, I think, felt compelled to come out with a mildly stronger line on that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And right, these are serious consequences. Again, I don't wish any ill will on the Ecuadorian people, right? I think we should be careful. I'm on the record rejecting unilateral coercive measures like the ones that the U.S. applies to Cuba and Venezuela. The point isn't to make the population suffer for the mistakes of their president, but there do need to be consequences, right? And I think this is a good start to show that, no, we won't tolerate this. Who do you think you are? I mean, I think in a way, the way he he's like, right before the vote, he was like, oh, they keep coming after us, with this embassy thing and all this kind of stuff. And I think he's trying to fit the mold that Bukele was starting to establish, right? Young guy, trying to be cool, wears aviator sunglasses, is defiant, but he's playing a very dangerous game. And so I'm glad to see this kind of consequences. And we can't forget, Mexico is taking Ecuador to the International Court of Justice, to the World Court in The Hague. And that's going to be held, that hearing is going to be held at the end of this month. So we'll be able to update you here on the podcast in terms of what comes of that. And I'm hoping that they'll be able to actually impose some important measures. I've seen that, thankfully, the foreign ministry is now openly calling for a means of returning Jorge Glass to Mexico, so because he is a protected person according to Mexican law and international law under the protection of the Mexican state, and should be returned to Mexico. And so I'm hoping that one of the measures that they issue is return this political prisoner to Mexico so that he can live safely under a political asylum. And I hope that that's one of the outcomes. So we'll see what comes of that. And then finally, as always, our favorite segment, I think, and it was going to be the shitty article of the week by Mark Stevenson, because he wrote another terrible article, and we were going to get into it, but we're going to give you a break, Mark. You're off the hook in this week, because we got something worse, believe it or not. We have the
I don't even know where to start on this
Bloomberg. One. Yeah, it's called Odd Lots, and I think they're onto something there. what AMLO's legacy means for Mexico's upcoming election, which is a fair question. You know, we talked about that article last week in the New York Review of Books. We talked about my piece in Al Jazeera. It makes sense. AMLO is the, the elephant in the room in this election, and that's kind of what the episode is getting into. But my gosh, it descends into parody almost immediately. Now, for copyright reasons, I'm not going to actually play it, but the two people on the show are Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway, and it's incredible because they start by admitting that nobody talks about Latin America enough. They know, people talk about Europe, but actually, it's more important that we talk about Latin America, Mexico, the U.S.'s #1 trading partner right now. Both people are very ignorant, and they admit it. But here's the first guy, Joe, says, it's just a sort of part of the world I don't think we've covered enough. Okay, good. I agree. I mean, that's part of the reason we started this podcast. We need to have better coverage of Mexico and Latin America. And then we have Tracy say, no, I have to admit, this is a total or almost total geographic and economic blind spot for me. I just haven't spent that much time in Latin America. I haven't read that much about it. I think the stories are becoming increasingly interesting. I think if you look at something like Mexico, for instance, there's all this enthusiasm of the theme of nearshoring, the idea that American companies are going to build these big factories over there. It's going to be a big beneficiary of trade tensions with China. But at the same time, there's this political backdrop, which as far as I understand it, is about to heat up in the shape of the Mexican presidential elections on June 2nd. And then Joe says, yes, that's right. This is a Mexican presidential election coming on June 2nd.
It's so good they
which is a
realize
perfect
there's going to be an election in Mexico. That's a good first step, guys. Yeah.
Ooh, at least, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, go on and on, again, confessing their ignorance, confessing that they don't know much about that. But nonetheless, here they are without any kind of shred of self-consciousness about the fact that being ignorant about this and accepting that you're ignorant means you're not the person that should be talking about this, right? It's a parody at this point. If you're this clueless, then do your work.
Do your homework, prepare.
Or leave it to somebody else. And quite literally, at one point, the speaker talks about, this is incredible. Tracy says, I'm just going to re-emphasize that I'm not entirely up to speed in the situation. I meant to come in this morning and sort of speed me my way through what's happening in Mexican politics. It's incredible to me. Do you think that you can get caught up on Mexican politics with a speed read in the morning? Like, that's going to be, I got it now. I figured it out. Oh, it must be. I know what it is. I know what's happening in that country. We have AMLO's hand-chosen successor, right? Because that's what they go with, of course, right? They ignore the fact that the actual person who was hand-chosen was not Claudia, but actually the opposition candidate, right? Oh, he's a populist. So I have it all figured out. It's unbelievable. I think it's quite revealing of just, these are the people who are informing the world about places like Mexico.
This is
and they
Bloomberg.
don't know what they're talking about.
This is Bloomberg, This is not our, shoe leather podcast done with 10 pesos. This is Bloomberg. They have resources. Do your homework. Prepare. We can't all be experts on everything. I understand that, right? But this kind of flippant ignorance about it, like, I don't know that much about it, but Mexico.
I'll read about it in the morning. That'll be
enough. And
then,
they bring in somebody who should know better, right? Who should know better, who's Andrea Novaro, who's covering business for U.S. here at Bloomberg and is based in Mexico City. So maybe they don't know much about it. Maybe Andrea Novaro should know more, right? But it's really extraordinary when you go through it, some of the things that she says. I'm just going to highlight a few of them because I took some notes, right? So the first thing she says is, the airport. That project was planned by AMLO's predecessor, Enrique Peña Nieto, and was going to be a very big airport. It was going to be beautiful. It was going to be state-of-the-art and handle 68 million passengers a year, But AMLO painted the airport as a thing of the elites, and the average Mexican would never use it, so he scrapped it, and that really scared investors. It's just such a first-grade way of dealing with this issue, right? This was a massive boondoggle of an airport that was set to benefit Mexico's ultra-wealthy, speculators and investors, that was going to be built on top of a lake bed, the Texcoco lake bed. And it was going to require them to be pumping water out of there eternally so that the airport didn't sink into the ground. Right now, Mexico is in the midst, the whole country is in the midst of a drought. Mexico City in particular is in the midst of a water shortage. What would have happened if they'd plunked a massive boondoggle of an airport on top of one of the last aquifers in the whole valley of Mexico City? But according to Andrea Navarro, it was going to be a big, beautiful airport, right? A big, beautiful airport that AMLO scrapped. And then another thing he did to scare investors was he changed the rules of how airport operators can charge different fees. We have 3 big companies here that operate most of the airports in Mexico, and it was just one of these moves where nobody saw it coming, and they sold the shares of these companies, and the companies had losses. Oh, these poor companies. We talked about at the beginning of the program about the privatizations of the 80s and 90s. The airports in Mexico were also privatized, and they were handed over to these companies that charge exorbitant airplane user fees. It's called the TUA. And that's why flights are so expensive in Mexico, especially domestic flights, because you have to pay an exorbitant user fee that doesn't go to the government. It goes to these private companies, the TUA. And so what the AMLO administration did was, as a center-left government should do, reduced the TUA. But that's very bad for Andrea Navarro. That's very bad, because that money was going right to private companies, then had some losses on the stock market. We're all very sorry for that. Then the electricity point, right? She admits that there have been droughts over the past 2 years, right? Doesn't seem to connect that to the idea that she was in favor of putting an airport on top of a lake, but fine, right? She said there's a big problem with supplying and distributing electricity. So there are a lot of industrial parks that have to set up their own generators, their own grids. Wow, really? Really? They have to set up their own grids? She's trying to make it out that Mexico doesn't have enough electricity production. Mexico has plenty of electricity production. The problem is that due to the previous electricity law that the AMLO government has attempted to reform and has been shot down by the Supreme Court, the Public Electricity Agency, the CFE, was not allowed to generate private energy. The public sources of energy were forced to sit idle so that private companies could put their electricity into the grid and make guaranteed earnings on that. So this is absolutely disingenuous, pretending this idea that, Mexico's this poor company that can't produce enough of its electricity. Oh, no. Industrial parks have to create their own generators and grids and stuff. No, that's not what happened. What happened is that private multinationals came in and used the grids to cannibalize it, to set up networks of their own partners to use the public network to make big money selling their own electricity. There's plenty of electricity capacity in Mexico. It was forced to sit idle, the public capacity, like Mexico's hydroelectric power and such, so that, Andrea Navarro's friends and Bloomberg's friends could cannibalize Mexico's grid. Doesn't tell you that part, right? Moving on, just for questions of time, right? There's so much in this silly piece. Homicides, she said, have shot up. Now, does she have any data on that? No. She says homicides have shot up. If you ask AMLO, he's going to tell you that there's been a tiny slowdown in the rate. It's a tiny slowdown that could just be a statistical error, not really a change in the trend. Actually, it's a 20% decline in homicides. That's outside of a statistical range of error. So she doesn't believe the official government statistics, and she's insisting that things have gone up.
Words,
Shut up.
right?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's just incredible. I'm reading this part here. It's the weasel words, which is that there are also many people who say, "What? That's how Donald Trump talks." People say that the statistics aren't trustworthy. You're a journalist, right? Go if you believe that, then you should have that available to you to say, actually, this study showed that there is certain lack of trust
what are your
in these statistics for the following reasons. Or las madres buscadoras have questioned, these or whatever. You can't just be like, there are many people. That you have to have more integrity, people, right? You have an obligation to the truth. That is the foremost responsibility of a journalist, to the truth, whether or not you like it or not, whether or not it fits your agenda or not. But they don't do that, right? Because it doesn't fit their agenda, because that would offend their bosses at Bloomberg that they should talk about what's actually happening in the country. So they use these weasel words and try to get away with, this lack of integrity
So I
in
don't
presenting
believe
information
official
this way.
statistics that homicides have gone down 20%, and even if they have, it's just within the margin of error. For me, they've shot up because I've talked to people who said they have. Right? Next, AMLO's reopening of the state of the public airline Mexicana. Right? She says money is being spent on these big-ticket infrastructure projects. She's very against big-ticket infrastructure projects, but was very in favor of the airport idea, which was the biggest ticket infrastructure project. So I really don't know where she really stands on that. On a state-run airline that nobody thought we needed. Who's nobody? The owners of the private airlines. But the president thought it would be, so he just launched an airline. So according to the remarkable ignorance of Andrea Navarro, AMLO just pulled a state-run airline out of his pocket, right? Mexicana is the oldest airline in the history of Mexico. It's the oldest airline in the history of Mexico that Felipe Calderon's government allowed to run into the grounds and left all of the workers out in the cold. The workers were occupying the Mexicana wing of the airport in Mexico City for a decade or more. It was a huge, long-term worker occupation. People don't screw around in Mexico. It's not you're just out with your signs for a day, walking in a circle, and you go home. They occupied that wing of the airport for a decade. AMLO's government finally provided justice to those workers, provided a just settlement to those workers, and resurrected Mexico's oldest public airline. So, this idea that he just decided to invent an airline is just so absurdly ignorant. And then she talks about the Santa Lucia airport, which is the airport they built instead of the one on top of the lake, the Felipe Angeles airport. So she says, I've never been there. Well, this is a problem, right? You're reporting on something you haven't been to. Fine. Do a little research. And I'm quoting literally here. But people are telling me that there is usually 1 or 2 flights a day, and some of these flights aren't all that full. Really? People are telling you? Did you check? Did you check how many flights a day there actually are? It's more than 1 or 2. Did you check? Or are you just going with people? Are these the same people telling you that homicides have shot up nationally? You don't bother to check. Right? These are, elite reporters making 20 to 30 times what José Luis and I make. And she also says at a certain point, probably more, I think inflation is under control in Mexico. She thinks. Look it up! Look it up! Look up how many flights there are on Santa Lucia.
You work at Bloomberg. You have a Bloomberg
Look up how
terminal.
many flights there are. I know that's not convenient to your agenda. Look it up before you go and make a fool of yourself on these podcasts. Look this shit up.
Yeah.
These people come down here. They make U.S. salaries. We've talked about this before. I'm not going to go through it again. They live the life of Riley in Mexico City, and they can't even be bothered to do the most basic research. They can't even be bothered to get their fingernails dirty on anything. I'm not even talking about going out and doing actual reporting. I'm just talking about a Google search that takes 30 seconds. People tell me that there's 1 or 2 flights a day. I mean, that's brilliant. And then it goes on from there. She's against big ticket projects, but, She's in favor of the old airport. And then, just to end with this one, they ask, well, then why is AMLO so popular if all that's happening? And she says, it's him. It's very strange, but it's just him. He has a magnetic pull. I'm talking about López Obrador. He has a magnetic pull. I mean, talk about trundling out the old stereotype of the messianic Latin American leaders manipulating these ignorant masses with their magnetic pull. I mean, wow. You know, it's not because he's produced results for people. And they do, to be fair, they do mention at a certain point, at least, some of the social programs and the minimum wage increase and, you know, a little bit, right? But I love this idea of the magnetic pull, right?
There's just, there's no real curiosity, right? There's no, I mean, if you're going to be a journalist, it's because you want to learn about the world, you want to learn about topics, you want to get into things, and you want to tell the world about that. But there's just no actual sincere curiosity. Yeah. It's very strange. I would never say that. Like for example, obviously, I'm ideologically firmly opposed to Javier Milei, but I'm curious how it happened. I want to understand how he got elected. I'm not just going to be like, well, he was very charming on the debates, and he must have fooled a bunch of people into voting. No, there's real explanations. There's social phenomena behind this. Do the work, and you'll actually be better at even understanding it through your own ideological framework if you want, right? For example, when they talk about here in the same podcast about, the nearshoring issue, it sounds like López Obrador isn't interested in, he's trying to push things to the south. There's a reason. The south of the country has seen historic underinvestment. It's the places where there are the least amount of jobs and the greatest amount of poverty and marginalization. It makes sense that a leader who's committed to attending to those very same excluded people would want to move investment there. Like, you can actually better understand the world, even through your own framework, if you're just a little bit curious, a little bit more honest. But I think the point here, and maybe we can close on this because we're at the end of the time here, which is that they're not going to change. These outlets are continually going to try to pull a fast one on you, to lie to you in the way, to be dishonest, to almost in an insulting way, flippantly deal with your country, thinking that, I'll just do a speed read in the morning and I'll be caught up enough to be able to.
One of them mentioned that they'd driven
program and ask the right questions.
Driven from Cancun down to Tulum, so they'd seen something.
Right. Exactly, right? Like, you and I, we get together and we talk about what are we going to talk about and how do we want to do it and in what order. Like, do the work, right? Go out and talk to normal people. And then you'll figure it out, what's actually happening, and maybe you'll have a better response. But they're not going to. And if they're not going to, stop listening to them. And if you are going to listen to them, be very, very critical. Be very, very suspicious of what you're being told. These outlets should not be trusted. And it makes me sad because, like I said, I'm a journalist. I believe in the profession. But these people
and be careful, too, because
because
according to Andrea Navarro, according to these people, when and if Claudia Sheinbaum takes office, she might just wind up being Medvedev to AMLO's Putin. Okay.
You think a woman would be more respectful of what is likely to be the first woman president, right? But this is who reports on the country. It's the same in Bloomberg as it is at New York Times and at Reuters and at AP with our friend Mark Stevenson. Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I've been your co-host, José Luis Granados Ceja, a Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City. And as always, I was joined by my co-host,
We'll see you next time on Soberanía.